Hey, TYT Politics. This is Nomi Konst. I am here in New York. I just got back from Albany yesterday, where there's a lot of heat coming out of Albany right now because they're in the middle of budget talks. And of course, we've been covering the Independent Democratic Conference, the group of 8 democratically elected senators who are working with Republicans through their own conference, and they have committee positions through the Republican deals that they have set up. And they are there at the table of the budget talks, and I figured we'd have a conversation of what that all means. What does that mean for New York? What does that mean nationally? What are the implications right now? So we have Ross Barkan, who is a journalist. He has been covering New York politics for several years. He recently wrote a piece in The Village Voice, and he writes for The Village Voice regularly. He also commentates for The Guardian, writes columns in The Guardian, and previously he was at The Observer, and I've just known him covering New York politics, forever. He's always breaking stuff and tweeting things out. So Ross, thanks for jumping on really fast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I was excited to be here.
Yeah. So we've been covering the IDC. For any of our viewers who don't know what the IDC is, could you just do a brief summary since you've been following them for a long time?
Sure. So they are a breakaway conference of now 8 Democrats who do not belong to the regular Democratic conference in New York State Senate. So they're in the upper chamber. And while they're all registered Democrats and they call themselves Democrats, they are a separate conference in the chamber. And so they were formed originally in 2011, and there are only 4 of them. And in 2013, they entered into a power-sharing agreement with the state Senate Republicans, who couldn't have had a majority in 2013 without the help of these 4 independent Democrats. And so now they have maintained their alliance with the Senate Republicans. The math of the state Senate is quite complex. But basically, the Senate Republicans have a very thin majority that they can maintain numerically, technically, without the help of the IDC. But the IDC gives them a real bulwark there. And there's also another Democrat, to add more confusion, a conservative Democrat who doesn't belong to the IDC, and he caucuses with the Republicans as well. So the IDC plus that conservative Democrat plus the Republicans has equaled a majority. And so the IDC has always maintained that they are progressive and they fight for progressive priorities and they do all these supposedly great things in New York State. But the truth is they've enabled and empowered state Senate Republicans. And, that power sharing alliance certainly in 2013 and 2014 allowed Senate Republicans to have a firm majority and allowed them to really block progressive legislation.
So you say that the IDC claims that they're progressive, and that's been sort of the conundrum that I've been trying to wrap my head around is in what areas have they been able to pass more progressive legislation than the Democrats in the majority in the Assembly and, of course, the Democratic governor would be able to do, of course, with the Republicans in the Senate.
So that's, and you have a right to be confused. So again, the IDC argument is, well, with the IDC, New York passed a minimum wage law, that will eventually raise the state minimum wage to $15 an hour. Certainly an accomplishment. I would argue that wasn't really the IDC's doing. It was Governor Cuomo, actually in concert with large labor unions as well as state Senate Republicans who cut a deal with the biggest labor union in the state to allow a minimum wage increase. So in turn, this labor union wouldn't help Senate Democrats try to retake the majority. So on the issues, if you go issue by issue, the IDC is pretty progressive. I mean, they support the DREAM Act, giving undocumented immigrants tuition assistance. I mean, they support minimum wage hikes. They've even apparently embraced single payer all of a sudden. But again, it's all a bit disingenuous because they are in a power sharing alliance with Senate Republicans. They have refused repeatedly to ally themselves again with the mainline Democratic Conference. And like you said, all the things the IDC supports, mainline regular Senate Democrats also support. And if New York were a more functional progressive state, like let's say California, you'd have a unified Democratic majority with a governor who cared about Democrats winning, which Governor Cuomo isn't really that person. And, you would probably have a lot more progressive legislation passing quicker. And so for me, I'm always very cynical when the IDC says we've done this, we support this. When in truth, when the rubber hits the road, they are helping prop up a Republican majority.
So we're in the middle of budget talks right now, and they're negotiating. It's due in a couple of days. Each chamber obviously has presented their budgets, and typically it's been three men in the room, right? That's how it's been for years. Because they're all men usually. Although if the majority were held by Democrats, it would be the first woman in the room, and of course, because the Democrats don't hold the majority leader, or the minority leader is not the majority leader. Gets a little confusing, but she's an African American woman. Okay, yeah. So with that being said, there are four people in the room, including the IDC conference leader. And today, there was a lot of talk about what's going to be in the budget, what's going to make it, what's not. Can you explain, what's most likely to be in the budget? Are progressives getting anything in a state that should be democratically controlled and progressive-leaning?
So, like you said, it's unclear, and these things are often hashed out, at the last minute under the cover of darkness at 3 a.m. in Albany. The big thing is raising the age, which New York is one of the only states in America where the age of criminal responsibility is lower, than 18, which is pretty
16, 17
bizarre.
Right.
16, 17-year-olds can be charged as adults. So this has been a big priority for the Senate Democrats. The IDC has also embraced this. It's something that Republicans may give ground on.
But to be fair, the IDC's, it's not the same version. I think that's right. A point that a lot of people don't know is they'll present their version, which is usually watered down compared to the mainline Democrats.
Right.
And raise the age, there's a hashtag right now going out, raise the age right, because the IDC came out yesterday saying that they were for raising the age. So what version comes through is a big question. There's also a renewal of a millionaire's tax, which is something was passed in, I think originally in 2011 or 2012, and Governor Cuomo supports. At the same time, it may not be something the Republicans want to give ground on. There's fights over education aid. I would say in general, this legislative session does not have really the big ticket transformational items that progressives are looking for. There's really nothing. There's nothing on ethics reform, for example. Nothing on public financing of campaigns. Even the DREAM Act doesn't look like it's anywhere near the budget right now. And which is also something the IDC has been saying they're for.
Supports, but yes, they support, and Senate Republicans don't support. And then they've gone back and forth, and IDC says, well, there are Senate Democrats who aren't super pro-immigrant, which is accurate. But again, when you have a unified majority, these are things you can negotiate and hash out. And sometimes lawmakers who, don't take votes in certain situations will change their votes. That's certainly true with Democrats, as you saw at the gay marriage fight, where in 2009, there were Senate Democrats who didn't vote for gay marriage. And then in 2011, when the bill came up again and there was more momentum behind it, they changed their vote. So in terms of that, it's another talking point where I'm very cynical, wherein I think if you had a unified Democratic majority and you really prioritized a few big progressive issues, you could probably get them done, especially if you got them to the desk of Cuomo, where while he is a triangulator, he's a centrist. If you throw a progressive bill on his desk, he will probably sign it because it looks bad if he doesn't, and he'd recognize that. And
that, of course, those bills aren't making it to his desk because the Democrats don't have control of the Senate.
Right. So, the Senate Republicans, with one brief interruption from 2009 to 2010, have controlled the upper chamber of New York State for a half century. I mean, I don't think people outside New York State or even within New York State realize that, the state Senate has been perpetually in the hands of Republicans, and that goes back to gerrymandering. It goes back to the lack of a unified effort to take back the Senate. Now, the IDC, and another problem with the IDC is the state Senate Democrats, since they're not unified at the IDC, when you have all these elections in swing districts, every 2 years, and the Senate Democrats are fighting for majority, the IDC doesn't spend a cent to defeat Republicans. They spend money in primaries to either elect one of their own to grow their conference, or they spend money fighting mainline Democrats, and now regular Democrats are going to be fighting IDC Democrats next year. That's guaranteed. So there's no effort, there's no unified effort in New York State. I'm talking about the governor and the state Senate to really elect enough progressive Democrats to have control of this chamber. And so this is why you have a divided government. This is why New York really lags behind a lot of other states. And this is why the IDC can, shout to the rooftops about all these great things they support, when if you're talking about, do you want to make New York more liberal, I would say they are absolutely part of the problem.
Very interesting. Why doesn't Governor Cuomo do something about this? You mentioned he's a moderate, but in the end, it's not. This is the era of Trump. This isn't 5 years ago. Now you have Trump, who comes from New York State, who literally knows many of these players and has worked with a lot of these players. And sometimes the messaging is just so similar coming from the state Republicans and the IDC to Trump that you'd think that Governor Cuomo, who has been rumored to want to run for president next time, would want to make the state as progressive as possible so he could be the progressive champion against Trump.
So it's a very good question. And yes, if Cuomo is serious about being a presidential candidate, I'm not convinced that he is. I think some of it is a media creation. He's never run a serious campaign in his life. He doesn't like retail campaigning. He doesn't like interacting with voters. He doesn't like traveling. These are all things he's going to have to overcome to actually be a candidate. But let's say he's dreaming about 2020. Yes, it's in his best interest to crush the IDC, create a unified Senate Democratic majority, and start passing liberal bills left and right. I mean, that's the way he would build a presidential campaign. Again, I'm not completely convinced that's what he wants to do. I think instinctually that's not something he's wanted to. So his first term as governor, he really resisted as much as he could beyond a few big ticket items like gay marriage, being a progressive, certainly on fiscal issues. And so the IDC for him really was a vehicle to ensure that there would be confusion in the state legislative body, infighting, so he can be by far the most powerful figure, but also a roadblock to bills that he considered too liberal. That's why Andrew Cuomo has always liked the idea of a Senate Republican majority. The assembly is always Democratic, so divided government has always suited his aims as a triangulator, as someone who never wanted the legislative body having too much power. I never wanted it going too far to the left. And so the IDC was like this perfect vehicle, which people have told me he had a role in creating. I give their leader, Jeff Klein, the credit for coming up with the idea, but Andrew Cuomo has enabled it every step of the way. He's done almost nothing realistically to elect Senate Democrats. The state Democratic Party, for example, which has a lot of money, does not spend very much, if anything, to elect Senate Democrats. It's a campaign, basically, account for Andrew Cuomo, to promote Andrew Cuomo, and he doesn't use his campaign funds to help Senate Democrats. I'll give you the example, and you remember, in 2014 when he ran for re-election, Senate Democrats ended up, being in a lot of very tough races against Republicans. Andrew Cuomo walked to re-election against a weak Republican, and he ended his campaign with something like $20 million in the account, some huge number in the bank. And Senate Democrats were like, well, why didn't you help? Why don't you spend this money on us? And he would say, well, I don't know, it's my money. So So it's this strange, right? So it's this strange dynamic of where, yes, if he wanted to be a presidential candidate, if he wants to be someone who's taken seriously in the national stage, a proud progressive New York governor would perhaps play well, but it's not in his nature. And I think that's the real issue.
How much of this is about those who are funding the members of the IDC? You know, there's a lot of real estate money, there's a lot of charter school money, and of course, that's all very important right now as the budget's being discussed and things are being leaked out. What does that play? What kind of role does that play in New York politics?
It plays a huge role. So New York State is one of the least progressive in America when it comes to campaign finance, when it comes to donation limits. We have very high limits on contributions. We have, they call it the LLC loophole, which is where you can create an LLC and it's treated like, an individual person basically under the election law. So it can contribute, tons of money. The real estate lobby, the charter school lobby, the finance industry, Wall Street, they play an incredibly large role in New York state politics because money can very easily infect the system. I mean, you have Citizens United, but you also have the weak election laws here. You have a state board of elections that doesn't really enforce anything. Mm-hmm. So what you have is a culture of money where a few wealthy individuals can cut very large checks to candidates. And so the IDC, as you said, takes charter school money. I believe there's some pretty big hedge funders in there. I'd have to double check on that. The real estate industry loves the idea of the IDC because the state Senate Republicans have always done the bidding of the real estate industry going back for decades. And so I go back to New York City, where I am, and we've had protections for tenants eroded over the past 20 years because it's all controlled by the state. We've lost a lot of rent-regulated apartments, and that's because of the work of the Senate Republicans. And the IDC is in collusion with this group. And so if you're a rich, real estate developer, you love the IDC. And so the IDC, it's this strange cognitive dissonance where they go, well, we're progressive. One of our members was a delegate for Bernie Sanders, Marisol Alcantara.
Which and then, I want to make it very clear, the Bernie Sanders delegates in New York have renounced her, just to be clear.
As they should, because I don't think Bernie Sanders would like the idea of an IDC, I imagine. Mm-hmm. So, they say we're progressive. So why do wealthy New York State real estate developers, why do charter school advocates, why do all these people invest in your future? And the reason is it's good for them. And behind the scenes, if they're honest with themselves, the IDC would probably recognize that truth.
And with that, being in this deal with the Republicans, they get access to larger, offices, larger staffs, and of course, committee chair positions. So, the IDC spokesperson always is countering my arguments online, and she'll say things like, we don't caucus with the Republicans, but you have committee positions. So if that's not caucusing, then what is caucusing? And when they control committees, they decide what legislation or what is moved forward. Yes, exactly. So again, it's sort of a word game. So yes, they're not a caucus, they're a separate caucus, but they're aligned with the Republicans. I mean, Jeff Klein is a de facto deputy to John Flanagan, who is the majority leader of the state Senate, who is a Republican. They work together. They share power together. They get committee chairmanships out of it, or they're vice chairs, or they all get bigger staff. Those things are there and they're undeniable. Also, there's a common IDC argument that, well, we're there, so Senate Republicans can't do bad things. I'm sure you've heard this one too, where they go, well, if it weren't for us, we all these bad Republican bills could get out of committee. They can get to the floor, they could pass, and we stop that from happening. And if you don't know that much about New York politics, you go, yeah, no, that makes sense. But there's also a lower house, the state assembly, which is entirely controlled by Democrats, be controlled by Democrats for the rest of our lives. And they can block any bad Republican bill.
in New York State, the issue isn't Senate Republicans pushing through conservative legislation that gets to the governor's desk. That never happens. That they don't get, super right-wing bills out there. But what they do get to do, and that what they've gotten to do for decades now, is water down or completely block progressive bills, liberal bills. And so, again, that's why we have no campaign finance reform. We have no ethics reform. We don't have real independent redistricting in New York State like you do in California. It's a very backward state in a lot of different metrics, and I blame the governor for that. I blame Cuomo, who's not invested in reform in any serious way, and I blame Senate Republicans, of course, and then the IDC for working with them.
How much?
They share blame too.
How much of this do you think? Because Cuomo will pick and choose some progressive legislation if he's pushed hard enough. But one form I don't see him changing his mind on anytime soon is ethics reform, but also closing the LLC loophole. And when you look at it, when you're able to take large chunks of money from several different LLCs, whatever that limit is, how much of that has to do with him raising money for his presidential race if he were to, say, run?
Sure. Well, I think it has as much to do with his governor's race. First, he has to run for re-election next year. So he has supported in words the closure of the LLC loophole. It's something he said, well, I support public finance. I support this. I support that. But if this legislation passed right now, it would severely hamper his ability to raise very large sums of money. I don't want to say as much for the presidential campaign as he's thinking on the state level. The reason Andrew Cuomo is probably going to sail to a third term is, everyone's afraid to run against him, but also he has a tremendous amount of money in his bank account. He can drop so much money in a heartbeat because, again, the wealthiest people in the state like him. They have a near unlimited ability to funnel money to his campaign and to the state Democratic Party. So any sort of change in this law is to his detriment because it's a huge hammer he wields over potential rivals. You look at New York City. New York City has public financing of campaigns, strict donation caps. You see possible rivals to the current mayor. They're not going to run because it's hard to beat an incumbent, but Bill de Blasio as mayor can't really just raise a ton more money than everyone else just because he's mayor. If you're a strong citywide candidate, you enter the system, you get public funds, and you can compete on his playing field. In the state, you can't do that. So Andrew Cuomo would have to basically give up one of his great fundraising tools. And at the end of the day, Andrew Cuomo does not give up power. That goes against everything he stands for. He's about consolidating his power at all costs. And he's done it for some very good things. But he's also, in my opinion, not used that power enough to really push progressive, important legislation.
Before we wrap up, there have been protests of these IDC members. In the last few weeks, it's really heated up this week. I think there were over 7 or 8 protests that occurred in the past week, where hundreds of people in some cases are showing up. Is it likely that they're going to feel the pressure to either go back to their conference, their Democratic conference, or get defeated in a primary?
So I think what's happening now is that they're circling the wagons and really closing ranks, the IDC. The fact that they've been attacked now and these huge protests have broken out, it really caught them off guard. I don't think any of them expected it. I didn't expect it myself. But the fact is you see them accusing, IDC critics of being racist, which is silly. What's going to happen?
You're referring to the Senate floor debate?
Yes. Yeah, so Marisol Alcantara, a Latina, accused the deputy leader of the Senate Democrats, Mike Gianaris, of white privilege for attacking the IDC, which is really insane, and an abuse of the word white privilege. I'm also offended, sort of, it's exploiting, what is an actual issue, white privilege, and really, misusing it to describe what's going on.
Well, when they're, especially because the Democratic conference, if they control it, an African American woman would be running it.
And it's a heavily minority conference. I mean, the power of the Senate Democrats lies in their downstate members of color. So you're going to see primaries next year. Several of them are very vulnerable. Alcantara won a three-way race last year, so she's going to be fighting for her life. The newest members, there's a Queens, Jose Peralta. He's going to have a fight for re-election. Tony Vella, who's been challenged before, he'll be challenged again. So they're going to be really pitched battles next year, and the outcome of those primaries will determine what happens next. So I think the Senate Democrats for a long time were seeking reconciliation. The IDC always claims, well, they never talked to Jeff, they never did anything. But the truth be told, they're rather tame. I myself was critical of the Senate Democrats for not really speaking up enough, for really voicing dissatisfaction with the IDC or even Cuomo. But that's really changed. I mean, they recognize that the moment in this Trump moment, grassroots progressives who learn about the IDC think it's a very strange or bad thing. So you're going to see primary challenges, and I think some of them will be successful. They're an 8-member conference, so I don't know if you can knock them down to 4 or less, or what number they'll end up at. But I do imagine someone will lose, and then after that, maybe they'll come to the table and there'll be some peace agreement and they'll reconcile, or maybe they'll just dig in and say, well, we've allied ourselves with the Republicans forever. We'll just keep doing it and screw you guys, which is something they could do. I don't really know exactly what's going to happen. Albany is really unpredictable. But right now, the IDC is really digging in for a fight, and the Senate Democrats are ready for a fight. And so there's at the moment, there's no talk of any reconciliation.
Ross, really fascinating stuff. I think this whole story is emblematic of the greater issue, because there are so few places in this country where Democrats could control an entire state. And this is a great opportunity for Democrats to be able to push forward legislation in a primarily democratically controlled, voter-controlled state. So really great conversation. Thanks, Ross. Ross Barkan.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
New York-based journalist. You can catch his work in Gotham. In the Village Voice and in The Guardian, amongst many other places. You can follow him on Twitter, right there below. All right, thanks, guys. This is TYT Politics.